They expected to be beaten, starved, humiliated. They were told Americans were monsters who showed no mercy. Instead, they were handed a simple bar of soap. And when the hot water touched their skin for the first time in months, these enemy soldiers broke down and wept. What happened next would challenge everything propaganda had taught them and reveal the true power of American values. The enemy's soap, a true story of World War II. The bar of soap trembled in her hands. White, thick, impossibly clean. It smelled of flowers, though she had almost forgotten what flowers smelled like after the long months of gunpowder and ash. Margaret Schmidt stood in line with 300 other German women, her heart hammering against her ribs, waiting for what she was certain would be the beginning of her humiliation. The building ahead hissed with steam. Water ran somewhere beyond those doors. And every woman in that line knew or thought they knew what happened to enemy prisoners when their captors wanted to break them. But the soap in her hands made no sense, the weight of it, the smoothness. She had not held real soap in 2 years. This is how the story began, not with cruelty as they had been promised, not with vengeance, but with something far more disturbing, with kindness. And that kindness would prove more devastating than any torture could have been. To understand why, you must go back. Back to the ruins of Europe, to the spring of 1912, to the moment when 4 women stood in a German railway yard and prepared to board a train that would carry them not home but into captivity. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Church bells rang across the continent. Rifles fired into the air. Banners proclaimed liberation. But for the women gathered in the shadows of those railway yards, this day meant something entirely different. It meant the end of everything they had known, the end of the Reich, the end of the world they had believed in, and the beginning of a journey into the unknown. Among the hundreds of women, 4 stood out, not because they were different, but because they were so ordinary, because their stories could have been anyone's story, because what would happen to them would reveal something profound about what it means to be human, to be wrong, and to face the truth. Margaret Schmidt was 25 years old. Before the war consumed everything, she had worked as a secretary in a Munich office building that no longer existed. She had typed orders she never questioned, filed reports she never read, and believed what she was told to believe. Her mother and younger brother were still alive somewhere in the ruins of their city. Her mother's last letter, smuggled to her before capture, had been clear. If the Americans catch you, pray for a quick death. They will not show mercy. Margaret carried those words like stones in her chest. Beside her stood Helene Bauer, 32 years old, a nurse from Hamburg. Her hands bore the scars of wartime medicine, of surgeries performed without proper tools, of wounds she could not heal. Her husband had died at Stalingrad 3 years ago. Her son Karl, 7 years old, lived with his grandmother in what remained of their neighborhood. The last news Helene had received said Karl was asking for her every day. She had not told him she had been captured. She had not told him she might never come home. Frieda Mueller, 19, stood apart from the others, her face still holding traces of the girl she had been before the bombs came. She had operated radio equipment for the Wehrmacht, listening to enemy broadcasts, transcribing coded messages she did not understand. Her entire family had died in the firebombing of Cologne. Parents, 2 sisters, grandparents, all gone in a single night of fire. She had nothing left to lose, which made her either the bravest or the most reckless among them. And then there was Elsa Kraus, 28 years old, a school teacher from Berlin who had taught children to salute, to believe, to hate. Her father had been an SS officer. She wore her loyalty like armor, her belief in the Reich's righteousness unshaken even as the Reich itself crumbled around her. She stood straight, jaw set, eyes hard. The others would break, she thought, but not her, never her. These 4 women, strangers to each other, boarded the same wooden boxcar that morning. The train lurched forward. Germany disappeared behind them, burning. The journey to the coast took 4 days through a landscape of ghosts. Charred towns drifted past the gaps in the boxcar walls. Churches without steeples. Bridges folded into rivers. Factories where smoke still rose from the rubble. At night, children's faces appeared in the darkness beside the tracks, thin as paper, watching the trains pass. Sometimes they waved. Sometimes they just stared. Inside the car, the women huddled together for warmth. Whispers circulated like fever. The Americans will not spare us. They will make examples. We should pray. We should prepare. Elsa moved through the car at night, her voice low but certain. Remember what we were told? They are not men, but wolves. They will try to break us. We must not let them see us weak. But her hand, Margaret noticed, trembled when she clutched her suitcase. They reached the port at Bremen, what was left of it. The harbor lay half destroyed, but American ships waited under foreign flags. The women were marched to the gangways past soldiers who watched them with expressions they could not read. Some looked curious, others indifferent. The women had expected snarls, insults, blows. Instead, there was only order, paperwork, lines. They were counted, tagged, divided into groups. It felt less like capture and more like some strange bureaucracy. Still, as the ship's engines groaned to life and the coastline of Europe began to shrink, dread settled into their bones like winter cold. The Atlantic stretched wide and endless ahead, and America, mysterious and distant, a land of myth and enemy propaganda, waited on the other side. Seasickness gripped them almost immediately. The steel holds stank of diesel and salt, and 300 women pressed too close together. Bunks were stacked 4 high. The air was thick enough to choke on. But on the third day, something happened that made no sense. Food arrived on metal trays. Real food. Pale bread, thick and soft. Slabs of meat that glistened with fat. Steaming mugs of coffee that smelled like something from before the war. From childhood, from a world that no longer existed. The women stared at the trays as if they were hallucinations. For 2 years, maybe 3, they had eaten whatever Germany's dying supply lines could provide. Cabbage stalks boiled until they fell apart. Bread made from sawdust and barley that sat in the stomach like clay. Watery soup ladled from rusted cans. And now this. Meat. Real bread. Coffee. Some refused to touch it. Elsa stood in the center of the hold, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Do not eat it. This is poison. This is how they will kill us. Slowly, to make us suffer. She had convinced perhaps a dozen women. They sat with arms crossed, staring at the food, trying to resist. But hunger has no loyalty. Hunger does not care about pride. Frida was the first to break. She picked up a piece of bread, held it to her nose, breathed in the yeast and wheat. If this is poison, she said, her voice shaking, then I will die happy. She bit into it. Her eyes closed. Tears began to stream down her face. She could not stop them. Around her, other women watched. Then one by one, they began to eat. The meat was rich enough to make them sick. The coffee burned their throats. But they ate anyway, some weeping openly, some laughing in disbelief, some eating in grim silence, as if committing a crime they could not name. Margaret ate slowly. Each bite felt like betrayal. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. We are eating weeds. We are drinking water that tastes of rust. And here she sat on an enemy ship eating meat her mother had not tasted in years. She wrote in her diary that night the small book she had somehow managed to keep hidden through everything. My mother eats sawdust. I eat real bread. How can I swallow this? How can I not? That night in the bunks as the ship rolled through dark waters, the 4 women found themselves pressed together by circumstance. Helene lay in the bunk above Margaret, Frida below, Elsa across the narrow gap. They did not speak at first. What was there to say? They were enemies of the state they had served, prisoners of the enemy they had been taught to hate, and they were being fed better than their own families. It was Helene who finally broke the silence. She spoke of her son, Carl, 7 years old, brown hair that fell into his eyes, a laugh that sounded like bells. He was with his grandmother in Hamburg. The last letter she had received said he was growing thin, that food was scarce, that he asked for his mother every night before sleeping. I am here, Helene whispered into the darkness, eating American meat while my son starves. No one answered. What answer was there here? Frida, in her bunk, stared at the steel ceiling inches from her face. Her family was ash, all of them. She had nothing to return to, no home, no mother to disappoint, no one waiting. Part of her, a part she would never speak aloud, wondered if staying in America might not be so terrible. The thought filled her with such shame she nearly wept again. Elsa lay rigid, eyes open, jaw clenched. She had not eaten the American food. She had forced herself to resist. But her stomach cramped with hunger, and the smell of the bread lingered in the air, and she wondered for just a moment if resistance was worth starvation. And Margaret wrote. The movement of her pencil across paper was the only sound she could control in a world that had spiraled beyond all control. She wrote, we are being taken far. None knows where. My mother will think I am dead. Perhaps I will be. The journey lasted 12 days. 12 days of rolling seas and uncertainty, and the slow realization that the enemy was not what they had been told. On the 10th day, a woman 3 bunks over began to sing, an old German folk song from before the war, before the marching, before everything. A guard appeared at the entrance to the hold, young, American, barely older than Frida. He listened for a moment, then said in accented but understandable German, "That is a beautiful song. My grandmother used to sing something like that." The woman stopped singing. The hold fell silent. The guard left. The women looked at each other in the dim light. Who were these Americans? Monsters did not compliment their prisoners' songs. Wolves did not speak of grandmothers. On the morning of the 13th day, someone shouted from above deck, "Land, America." The women crowded to the portholes to any gap that offered a view. And there it was, the coastline of a nation untouched by war. Buildings stood whole against the sky. No ruins, no craters, no smoke rising from what used to be neighborhoods. It looked like a photograph from another time, another world. The Statue of Liberty rose from the harbor, massive and green and holding her torch high. The irony was not lost on anyone. Liberty. They were prisoners arriving to a land that proclaimed freedom. Some women turned away from the sight. Others stared, unable to process what they were seeing. Crowds lined the piers as the ship docked. Some jeered. Some merely watched. The women were marched down the gangway, under guard, their boots echoing on wooden planks. The air smelled different here. Cleaner. It carried the salt of the ocean, but none of the ash of war. For the first time, some of them realized how completely their world had collapsed. Germany was rubble. America was whole. Standing. Alive. They were loaded onto buses. The vehicles were clean, well-maintained, nothing like the battered trucks that had carried them to the port in Bremen. As the buses rolled away from the harbor and into the American countryside, the women pressed their faces to the windows and stared. Green fields stretched to the horizon. Farmhouses with white porches sat beside roads that were paved intact, undamaged. Towns passed by where children rode bicycles, and families sat in yards and stores displayed goods in windows, without ration cards, without lines, without armed guards. It was incomprehensible. Where are the ruins, someone whispered. Where are the POWs? There were none. America had fought a war across 2 oceans and remained untouched at home. The contrast was so vast, so complete that it felt like traveling to another planet. Margaret watched a small town pass by. A church with a white steeple stood whole. Families walked together on sidewalks. A boy threw a ball to a dog in a yard. Ordinary life. Life as it had been before the war devoured everything. She had almost forgotten such a thing was possible. Is this truly the land of monsters, someone asked? Can this abundance be real? The buses drove for hours deeper into the American South. Georgia, someone said, or Louisiana. The landscape changed. Pine forests, red dirt roads. The heat pressed down even through the bus windows, and still everywhere they looked wholeness. Prosperity, a world that continued while theirs had ended. The camp appeared in the late afternoon. Camp Ruston, the guard said, or perhaps Fort Oglethorpe. The name mattered less than what they saw. Wooden barracks painted and maintained. Paths swept clean. Fences with barbed wire, yes, but not the brutal wire of concentration camps. Not the electrified death of prison camps they had heard about. This looked almost orderly, almost humane. The buses stopped at the gate. The women were filed off one by one, blinking in the bright southern sun, uncertain of what came next. American officers moved among them with clipped efficiency. Names were recorded, documents stamped, possessions cataloged. Each woman received a numbered tag. The process was mechanical, impersonal, but not cruel. The guards spoke with calm voices. Some had southern drawls that made the English sound almost musical. Others spoke with flat Midwestern tones, but none shouted. None struck them. None seemed interested in cruelty. For women who had braced themselves for monsters, this indifference was deeply unsettling. And then he appeared, Sergeant James Walsh. He stood at the processing station, clipboard in hand, face carved from stone. His eyes were gray and hard and held something the women recognized immediately, grief. This was a man who had lost something. This was a man who knew how to hate. He looked at them, these German women in their threadbare clothes, and something flickered across his face. Not pity, not quite contempt. Something more complicated. Something that mixed duty with personal pain in equal measure. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said. His voice was flat, professional. "Follow the rules and you will be fine. Break them and there will be consequences, but we do not torture. We do not starve. We do not execute. This is America. We have standards." The words should have been reassuring. Somehow they made everything worse. Standards. The enemy had standards. What did that say about the nation they had served? Margaret watched Sergeant Walsh as he supervised the processing. She noticed the wedding ring on his left hand, the small pin on his collar that might have been a memorial of some kind, the way his jaw tightened when he looked at them. This man hated them. She could see it, feel it, but he would not touch them. Orders were orders. Duty was duty. What kind of enemy was this? They were led through the camp in groups, past barracks that smelled of fresh wood and pine tar, past a mess hall from which the scent of cooking food drifted, past a building from which steam rose in white clouds. The delousing station, a guard explained. The women stopped walking. This was it. This was the moment they had dreaded since the trains had carried them from Germany. This was where the masks would come off, where the kindness would end, where the real treatment of prisoners would begin. Whispers rippled through the line. This is where they will humiliate us. This is where it starts. One woman clutched her suitcase as if it were a shield. Another crossed herself silently, lips moving in prayer. The line moved slowly toward that building. Each step felt like walking toward execution. Margaret's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Beside her, Helene had gone pale. Even Frida, who had seemed almost reckless in her lack of fear, now looked terrified. And Elsa, rigid Elsa, who had maintained her composure through everything, had tears in her eyes that she refused to let fall. The door opened, steam poured out. The sound of running water echoed from inside. "Stand together," Elsa hissed. "Show no fear. Whatever they do, we endure it with dignity." They stepped inside. The room was tiled, white tiles from floor to ceiling. Water ran from pipes overhead. And there on a table by the entrance sat stacks of towels, clean towels, white towels that looked like they had never been used. And beside them, arranged in neat rows, bars of soap. Real soap, thick, white, smelling faintly of flowers. A woman in an American uniform stood by the table. Not a guard. A nurse, perhaps, or a volunteer. She smiled, though the smile looked tired. She gestured to the soap and towels. "For you," she said in broken German. "For cleaning. The showers are private. Take your time." The women stared. This could not be real. This had to be a trick. Some elaborate cruelty. Give them hope and then crush it. Give them dignity and then strip it away. But the nurse simply waited. Behind her, the sound of hot water running, steam rising, the smell of soap. Margaret was handed a bar. The weight of it shocked her. Solid. Real. She lifted it to her nose before she could stop herself. Flowers. Lavender, perhaps, or rose. Something that belonged to a world before ash and death. Around her, other women were receiving their own bars, towels, clean clothes to change into after. Not uniforms, just plain dresses. Work clothes. Clean. One by one, they moved toward the shower stalls. Private stalls. Not the communal degradation they had expected. Individual spaces with curtains that could be closed. The first woman to step under the water screamed, not in pain, in shock. The water was hot, actually hot. Not lukewarm, not cold, hot enough to steam, hot enough to wash away the grime of months. She stood under the spray and began to sob. The sound echoed off the tiles. Other women heard it. Some thought it was pain. But when they reached their own showers, when the hot water touched their own skin, they understood. Margaret stepped under the spray and felt her knees nearly buckle. The water was hot. The soap lathered thick and white in her hands. She scrubbed its skin that had not been truly clean in longer than she could remember. Dirt and sweat and despair washed away down the drain. Her hair, which had been stiff with oil and dust, came alive again under her fingers. She began to cry. She could not stop herself. The tears mixed with the water and the soap and the steam, and she stood there sobbing as months of fear and exhaustion poured out of her. In the stall beside hers, Helene stood with the soap in her hands, staring at it as if it were a miracle. She had treated wounds with dirty rags. She had worked without gloves, without proper supplies, without hope. And now the enemy gave her soap, real soap, the kind that smelled of flowers. She brought it to her face and wept into her wet hands. Frida laughed, a sound that was half joy, half hysteria. She scrubbed at her arms until the skin turned pink, then scrubbed more. She washed her hair 3 times. 4. She could not get enough of the feeling of being clean, of being human again. Even Elsa, proud Elsa, who had refused to show weakness, stood under the water with her head bowed and her shoulders shaking. She did not make a sound, but tears fell. They mixed with the water and disappeared, and no one could prove she had cried. But she had. They emerged from that building transformed, hair clean and damp, skin scrubbed pink, wearing clothes that were simple but whole. They looked at each other as if seeing strangers, as if seeing themselves for the first time in years. "You look like a person again," Helene said softly to Frida, reaching out to touch the younger woman's wet hair. "We forgot what it felt like," Margaret whispered. "To be clean, to be treated like humans." That night they were shown to their barracks, real beds with thin mattresses, blankets that smelled of starch and cotton, pillows. When had they last slept on pillows? But before sleep, there was one more shock. They were led to the mess hall for their first meal in camp. The building was long and plain, but the smell that poured from it made them stop in the doorway. Coffee, real coffee, bread baking, something frying in grease. The scent was so thick, so overwhelming, it felt like a physical thing. Inside, tables stretched across the hall. American guards sat at some eating the same food. This was not prisoner rations. This was simply food. Boiled potatoes, carrots, beef stew with chunks of actual meat, soft rolls with butter. Butter. When had they last seen butter? Steam rose from serving trays. A cook in a white apron stood behind the counter, dropping spoonfuls of stew onto metal plates. He did not smile, but he did not sneer either. He simply served food. Next, next, next. The women accepted their trays as if handling explosives. Some could not meet the cook's eyes. Others stared at the food, trying to determine if it was real, if this was actually happening. Margaret sat at a long table. She looked down at her tray. Stew with meat that glistened with fat. A roll so soft it gave under her finger. Coffee that sent steam curling into the air. She dipped her spoon into the stew, watched the grease float on top, lifted it to her mouth. The taste exploded across her tongue. Rich, salty, real. She pressed her hand to her mouth, afraid she might vomit from the richness of it. Around her, other women had similar reactions. Some ate slowly, reverently. Some devoured everything, tears streaming down their faces. Some simply sat and stared, unable to process the abundance. "My brothers starved in the snow," someone whispered. "And here they feed us like this." No one replied. There was no reply. The guards paced slowly between tables. One young soldier, hardly older than Frida, gave a crooked smile as he passed, as if to say, "It is okay. You can eat." No one stopped them. No one mocked them. The meal continued in near silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons on metal and the occasional swoops someone could not quite suppress. That night, lying in bunks that smelled of clean linen, staring up at wooden rafters in the darkness, Margaret wrote in her diary by the light of a small lamp someone had left burning. "We were told we would be beaten, mocked, broken. Instead, we were given soap, hot water, food, clean beds. How can this be? We expected beasts. We found something we cannot name, something that makes the hatred we were taught feel hollow, something that makes us question everything we believed." She paused. The pencil trembled in her hand. Outside, American crickets sang through the night. A sound so foreign, so peaceful, it felt like it belonged to another universe. What kind of enemy gives soap to those they have every right to destroy? What does it mean when the enemy shows more dignity than your own nation ever did? She did not have answers. None of them did. They lay in the darkness, 4 women who hours ago had been filthy and terrified, now clean and fed, and profoundly disturbed. The war had ended, but in their minds another war had begun. A war between everything they had been taught and everything they were experiencing. Between propaganda and reality. Between hatred and the uncomfortable recognition of shared humanity. Through the window stars shone over Louisiana, the same stars that shone over the ruins of Germany, the same stars that had witnessed everything. Margaret closed her diary. Outside, a guard walked past, boots crunching on gravel. Inside, 300 German women tried to sleep in beds softer than any they had known in years. And somewhere in the camp, Sergeant Walsh sat alone in the guard stations, staring at a photograph of his brother. The brother who had died on a beach in France, killed by German guns. Walsh had volunteered for this duty. He had wanted to face the enemy, to make them pay in small ways. Denied food, denied comfort, denied anything beyond bare survival. But orders were orders, Geneva Convention standards. He had to feed them, house them, treat them with basic human dignity, and watching them cry over soap, over hot water, over simple food, he had felt something shift inside him. Something he did not want to feel. Something dangerous. They were supposed to be the enemy, faceless, evil, easy to hate, but they had faces, young faces, scared faces. The face of the woman who had said thank you in broken English when he had held a door. The face of the girl who looked barely old enough to have served in any army. The face of the nurse who had the same tired eyes as the medics he had known. He put the photograph away. Tomorrow there would be work assignments, routines to establish, a camp to run. But tonight, in the quiet hours before dawn, James Walsh sat with a question he had not expected to face. What do you do when the enemy refuses to be what you need them to be? He had no answer, so he sat in silence listening to the crickets and waited for morning. The morning bell rang at 6. Margaret woke to a sound she had not heard in months' silence. Not the silence of fear or death, but the simple quiet of a place where bombs did not fall. Outside the barracks window, Louisiana morning light filtered through pine trees. Birds sang. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. The normality of it felt like a violation. Around her, women stirred in their bunks. 3 weeks had passed since the soap. 3 weeks of routine that should have felt like imprisonment, but instead felt like something else entirely. Something none of them had words for. Breakfast waited in the mess hall, the same abundance as always. Oatmeal thick with butter and brown sugar. Eggs, toast, real jam made from fruit. Coffee that steamed in heavy ceramic mugs. Margaret took her tray and sat at a table where Helene and Frida already ate in silence. The guilt of eating had not lessened. If anything, it had grown heavier with each meal. Across the hall, Elsa sat with a small group of women who still refused to smile, who ate with grim determination, who treated every kindness as an insult to be endured. Margaret watched her sometimes and wondered which of them was right. Was it better to resist or to accept? To hold on to hatred or to let it go? The questions had no easy answers. After breakfast came work assignments. The camp needed labor. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be paid for their work, a fact that had shocked everyone. Paid. With actual money. Camp script, yes, but currency nonetheless. Currency that could be used to buy things. Margaret was assigned to the laundry, a large building where American uniforms arrived dirty and left clean. The work was hot and damp, but not difficult. She stood at massive steel washing drums, loading clothes, adding soap, watching the water turn gray with dirt. The smell of starch and bleach became familiar. Her hands grew soft from the constant moisture, but it was the names that haunted her. Each uniform bore a tag. Each tag had initials. PFC Miller D. Corporal Hayes R. Sergeant Walsh J. These were people, men who had homes and families and lives beyond this camp. She washed their clothes with a strange reverence as if handling sacred things. One morning she found a uniform with dried blood on the sleeve. Not much, just a dark stain that had set into the fabric. She scrubbed at it carefully, wondering whose blood it was. An American soldier injured somewhere, or German blood from some skirmish she would never know about. The stain came out eventually, the water running pink, then clear. She folded the uniform with extra care. Sergeant Walsh came to collect laundry one afternoon. She was folding a shirt when she noticed the name tag. Walsh J., his brother. This had been his brother's uniform. Kept, preserved, a memorial to a man who had died in Europe. She looked up. Walsh stood in the doorway watching her hold the shirt. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she folded it with deliberate gentleness and placed it on top of the clean pile. "Your brother," she said quietly in her broken English. Walsh said nothing. He took the uniform and left. But something had passed between them. Some acknowledgement that grief crossed all borders. That loss was loss, no matter which flag you served. Helene worked in the kitchen and infirmary assigned there because of her nursing experience. An American woman worked alongside her. Dorothy Miller, young perhaps 24 with kind eyes and a smile that seemed genuine, even when there was no reason to smile. She was a volunteer, Helene learned. She did not have to be here. She chose to help. This baffled Helene completely. Who volunteers to help enemy prisoners? Dorothy tried to make conversation. She spoke about her family's farm in Iowa, about her brother who served as a guard in this same camp, about the vegetable garden she missed. Helene responded with single words. Yes, no, thank you. She could not bring herself to be warm, could not risk friendship with the enemy, even an enemy who seemed incapable of cruelty. But she watched Dorothy work, watched her change bandages on a woman with infected blisters, watched her speak gently to a prisoner who was crying, watched her share her own lunch with someone who looked particularly hungry. And Helene wondered what kind of propaganda had taught people like Dorothy to be kind. Frida worked in the fields outside the camp, harvesting vegetables under the brutal southern sun. The work was hard, but she did not mind. After years of sitting at radio equipment in dark rooms, the physical labor felt almost cleansing. Her arms grew strong, her skin darkened. She sang sometimes while she worked old German folk songs that made the other women smile with nostalgia. The guards rotated, but one appeared more often than others. Corporal David Miller, Dorothy's brother. He was young, perhaps 22, with sandy hair and an easy manner that seemed at odds with military service. He watched the prisoners work, but did not bark orders. He carried water to them when the heat grew too severe. He called them ma'am, which made some of them laugh bitterly. One afternoon, Frida was struggling with a particularly stubborn vine. Corporal Miller approached and showed her a better technique, demonstrating with his hands. She watched carefully, then tried it herself. It worked. She looked up and smiled without thinking. "Thank you," she said in English she had been practicing. "You are welcome," he replied. Then after a pause, "Where did you learn English?" "Radio operator," she said. "I listen to American broadcasts, music sometimes." Bing Crosby. "Frank Sinatra." His face brightened. "You know Sinatra?" She nodded. "Very much. Before the bombs, I have his record." The conversation lasted only a moment before he had to move on. But it was the first real conversation she had had with an American. The first time someone had spoken to her as a person rather than a prisoner. It stayed with her for days. 3 weeks became 4. The routine solidified. Work, meals, evening hours in the barracks where women wrote letters home or played cards or simply sat in silence. The physical changes were impossible to ignore. Faces filled out, cheeks regained color, hair grew lustrous. Bodies that had been gaunt now had flesh on them again. Margaret caught her reflection in a window one evening and barely recognized herself. She looked healthy, well-fed, almost prosperous. The guilt crashed over her like a wave. Then came mail call. The announcement rippled through the barracks like electricity. Letters from Germany. Censored, certainly. Censored. Delayed by weeks, but letters. Contact with home, with the world they had left behind. Margaret received one envelope. Her mother's handwriting on the front, shaky but recognizable. She held it for a long moment before opening it, afraid of what it might contain. "My dear daughter," it began, "we are alive. Your brother works in the rubble every day clearing what was our neighborhood. There is little food. We eat what we can find. Potatoes mostly. Sometimes bread, though it is more sawdust than flour. We sleep in the cellar because the upper floors are gone. The winter will be hard. If you have anything, send it. We are starving. Come home when you can. We need you." Margaret read it 3 times. Then she walked outside and vomited behind the barracks. She stood in the twilight, hands on her knees, tasting bile and shame. Inside the mess hall, dinner was being served. Pot roast, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh bread, while her mother ate potato peels and slept in a cellar. Helene's letter came in a different hand. Not her mother-in-law's flowing script, but something more formal. She opened it slowly, already knowing, already feeling the weight of what it would say. Helene, I must tell you, Carl is gone. The pneumonia took him 3 days ago. We had no medicine, no food to give him strength. He asked for you at the end. He said, when will Moody come home? I told him you would come soon. Forgive me for the lie. Forgive me for failing him. He is buried in the churchyard, what remains of it. Come home. There is nothing left but grief. Helene read the words. Read them again. The paper trembled in her hands. The other women in the barracks grew quiet, sensing something terrible. She stood up, walked to the door, crossed the compound to the mess hall. It was after dinner, but food still sat on the serving line. Mountains of it. Leftovers that would be thrown away or saved for tomorrow. Meat, vegetables, bread, pea. She looked at it all, this abundance, this impossible, obscene abundance. Something inside her broke. She reached out and swept her arm across the nearest table. Trays crashed to the floor, food scattered. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. My son is dead, she said. Her voice was quiet at first, then louder. My son is dead. While I ate your food, while I slept in your beds, while I grew fat, my son starved. He was 7 years old. 7. Her voice cracked into a scream on the last word. Guards rushed in, Sergeant Walsh first, always first. But he did not grab her. He stopped a few feet away, understanding in his eyes that this was not defiance. This was grief. Dorothy appeared from somewhere running. She wrapped her arms around Helene as the German woman collapsed sobbing. Great wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and ancient, the place where mothers keep their children's memories. He asked for me. Helene wept. He died asking for me, and I was not there. I was here, eating. While he starved, the mess hall was completely silent. Every prisoner, every guard frozen. Some of the German women were crying. Some of the American guards looked away, uncomfortable with emotion this raw. Walsh made a small gesture. The guards backed off. Dorothy held Helene, rocking her, slightly murmuring words that meant nothing and everything. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Over and over, Margaret stood in the doorway watching, her own letter clutched in her hand. We are eating while our children die. She had written those words in her diary weeks ago. Now they were not metaphor, but reality. Helene's son was gone, dead from hunger and disease, while his mother lived in comparative luxury. That night, the barracks were silent. Helene lay in her bunk, eyes open, staring at nothing. Dorothy had brought her tea, had sat with her until lights out, had held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. The other women lay in their own bunks, processing their own letters, their own guilt. Frida had received no letter. Her family was ash and there was no one left to write. But she cried anyway for Helene, for Carl, for all the children who had died while adults played at war. Even Elsa looked shaken. She had received a letter too. Her father, the SS officer, was in prison awaiting trial. Her mother had fled Berlin. Her childhood home was rubble. The Reich she had believed in was being dismantled, piece by piece, its leaders hunted, its crimes exposed. But she said nothing. She lay rigid in her bunk, jaw clenched, refusing to break. The next morning, the women went back to work because there was nothing else to do. Helene moved like a ghost through the kitchen, her hands performing tasks her mind could not focus on. Dorothy stayed close, not speaking, just present. In the laundry, Margaret washed uniforms and thought about her brother clearing rubble. 15 years old, doing a man's work in a destroyed city, while she stood in a clean room with hot water and American soap. In the fields, Frida pulled weeds and tried not to think about the fact that she had smiled yesterday, had laughed, had enjoyed the sun on her face. While somewhere in Germany, a 7-year-old boy had died asking for his mother. But then on the 5th week, they were told about the canteen. The building sat at the edge of the compound, small and plain. The guards led groups of women there and explained, you earn wages for your work. Camp scrip. You can use it to purchase items here. The door opened. Inside shelves lined the walls. And on those shelves sat things that belonged to another world, another life. Chocolate bars. Hershey's, the wrapper said. Brown and silver, stacks of them. Cigarettes. Lucky Strike. Camel. Candy. Hard candies in bright wrappers. Soap. Bars of ivory soap like the ones they had been given that first day. Pencils. Paper. Envelopes. Lipstick. red tubes of lipstick that gleamed like jewels, combs, mirrors, handkerchiefs. The women stood in the doorway and stared. This was not survival. This was luxury. This was abundance beyond anything they had known even before the war. How much someone asked. The prices were listed. A chocolate bar cost a few cents of scrip, a pack of cigarettes slightly more. The lipstick was expensive but not impossible. Frida was among the first to buy something. She had earned enough scrip from her fieldwork. She approached the counter, pointed to a Hershey bar, and handed over her payment. The transaction felt surreal. She was buying chocolate in a prison camp from the enemy. She took the bar outside, sat on a bench, and unwrapped it slowly. The smell hit her first. Sweet, rich. A smell from childhood, from before everything. She bit into it. The chocolate melted on her tongue, thick and creamy and impossibly good. Tears streamed down her face. She could not stop them. She sat in the Louisiana sun and cried while eating chocolate. "I have not tasted this since I was a child," she whispered to no one. "Since before the bombs. Since before everything died." Other women made their purchases. Some bought cigarettes and smoked them with shaking hands. Some bought soap to send home, though they were told packages might not reach Germany. Some bought nothing, stood in the canteen with arms crossed, refusing to participate in this strange economy. Margaret bought a pencil and a notebook for her diary. The old one was nearly full. She needed a new one to continue documenting this impossible situation. Helene bought nothing. She stood looking at the shelves and could not bring herself to choose. What did it matter? What did any of it matter? Her son was dead. He had died and hungry, and here was chocolate. Here was abundance. Here was everything he would never have. Dorothy found her there, frozen in the canteen. Gently, she led her outside. "You do not have to buy anything," Dorothy said softly. "You do not have to do anything. Grief has no timeline." Helene looked at her. This American girl with her kind eyes and her gentle voice. "Why do you help us? We are the enemy." Dorothy thought for a moment. "Because you are people. Because I believe we are supposed to help people, even when it is complicated. Especially when it is complicated. We killed your soldiers, and our bombs killed your cities. War is terrible. It makes everyone complicit, but it does not have to make everyone cruel." Helene had no response to that. She simply nodded and walked back to the barracks. That evening, Margaret wrote in her new notebook, "We are given luxuries while our families scavenge for scraps. They offer us chocolate while our children starve. What are we supposed to do with this? How do we carry it? The shame is heavier than chains. The food nourishes our bodies but poisons our souls." But the work continued. The routine held. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to shift. Frida and Corporal Miller spoke more often during fieldwork. Short conversations in broken English and simpler German. He told her about Iowa, about cornfields that stretched to the horizon, about winters that turned everything white. She told him about Cologne, about the cathedral that had somehow survived when everything else burned, about her family carefully, the grief still too raw. One afternoon, he gave her an apple from his lunch. She hesitated, aware that other prisoners were watching, aware that this simple act would be noticed and judged. "Please," he said, "I brought extra." She took it. The apple was crisp and sweet and perfect. She ate it slowly, savoring every bite. Across the field, Elsa watched with narrowed eyes. Margaret and Sergeant Walsh developed an unspoken understanding. He came to the laundry more often than necessary. She handled his brother's uniform with extra care. They did not speak much, but when they did, it was with a strange honesty. "How did he die?" she asked one day. "Your brother." Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "Normandy, first wave. He made it to the beach, then German machine guns. I am sorry." He looked at her. "Your people killed him." "I know, I am still sorry. Death is death, loss is loss." He nodded slowly and left. Helene and Dorothy worked side by side in the infirmary. Dorothy showed Helene American medical techniques. Helene showed Dorothy tricks she had learned in field hospitals, where supplies were scarce. They developed a rhythm, a partnership, and slowly, carefully, something that might have been friendship. One day, Dorothy brought a photograph. Her family, parents, brother, herself, standing in front of a white farmhouse in Iowa, smiling, Whole. This is my world, Dorothy said. This is what I come from. Helene looked at the photo, at the abundance visible even in a simple picture. The house intact, the family together. The future still possible. My world is gone, Helene said quietly. This is all I have now. This camp, this work, the memory of a son I failed. You did not fail him. The war failed him. Germany failed him. You survived. That is not failure. Helene wanted to believe that. She was not sure she could. 6 weeks into their captivity, the announcement came. Selected prisoners would be taken into nearby towns for work details. Agricultural work, helping local farmers with harvest. The women selected for this duty gathered nervously. This would be the first time most of them had seen American civilian life up close. The first time they would interact with ordinary Americans beyond guards and volunteers. They loaded into trucks early one morning. The trucks drove through countryside that made Margaret want to weep. Intact, whole, beautiful. Farmhouses sat on green land, barns stood straight and painted, children played in yards, dogs ran free. Life continued here as if the war had never touched it, because it had not. That was the truth that cut deepest. America had fought a war across 2 oceans, and its homeland remained paradise. The truck stopped at a large farm, the Johnson property, the guard said. Elderly couple, lost their son in the war, but still willing to employ German prisoners for harvest work. A rare kindness. The women climbed down from the trucks and stood uncertainly in the farmyard. An elderly man emerged from the house. Mr. Johnson, perhaps 70 back bent from years of labor eyes that had seen too much. He looked at the German women. They looked back. The moment stretched. Then his wife appeared. Mrs. Johnson, smaller, gray-haired, wearing an apron dusted with flour. She carried a large pitcher and glasses. It is hot, she said simply. You will need lemonade. She poured glasses and handed them to the prisoners. The women took them hesitantly as if expecting poison or a trap. But it was just lemonade, sweet and tart and cold. Thank you, Frida said in careful English. Mrs. Johnson smiled. You speak well. Where did you learn radio operator? I had to understand American broadcasts. Well, you are not broadcasting now. You are just young women, far from home, working in the heat. Drink. They drank. The lemonade was perfect. Some of the women had tears in their eyes again. Kindness kept breaking them in ways cruelty never could. Mr. Johnson showed them the work, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, squash. The work was familiar to the farm girls among them. The city women struggled, but learned quickly. Mr. Johnson moved among them as they worked watching. His face was unreadable. At midday, he approached the group. They stopped working, uncertain. I lost my boy at the bulge, he said. His voice was rough. German artillery. December of '44. He was 19 years old. The women froze. This was it. This was where the kindness ended. This was where the real hatred would show. Mr. Johnson continued, I wanted to hate all of you. When they told me German prisoners would work my farm, I wanted to say no, to refuse, to make you suffer somehow. Silence. Even the guards were quiet. But you are not the enemy, he gestured at them. You are just girls, somebody's daughters, maybe somebody's mothers. War makes enemies of people who would otherwise be neighbors. My boy and whatever German fired that shell, they probably had more in common than different. Both scared, both fighting because they were told to. Both dead now for reasons that seemed smaller every year. He turned and walked back to the house. The women stood motionless. Some were crying. Mrs. Johnson brought them lunch. Sandwiches made with real meat, fresh bread, crisp vegetables from the garden. Sweet tea, cookies still warm from the oven. Eat, she said gently. You have been working hard. They ate. And Margaret wrote in her mind, composing entries she would transfer to her diary later. The enemy has a face now, and it looks like us. Tired, grieving, human. The day ended. The work was done. As they loaded back into trucks, Mrs. Johnson pressed a small bag into Frida's hands. Cookies, she whispered, for the girls, to share. Frida looked into the woman's kind face and could not speak. She simply nodded. On the drive back to camp, the women were quiet, processing what they had experienced, kindness from people who had every reason to hate them, forgiveness from those who had lost everything. But tomorrow would bring something that would shatter even this fragile peace. Tomorrow they would be taken to a church hall in town. Tomorrow they would see more of America. Tomorrow they would eat at tables prepared by volunteers. And tomorrow they would begin to understand that the enemy they had been taught to hate was not an enemy at all, but something far more complicated. Something that made every lie they had believed start to crumble. The trucks rolled through the Louisiana evening. Inside, German women held cookies from an American grandmother and wondered what truth even meant anymore. The church hall sat at the edge of a small Louisiana town whose name Margaret would never remember. What she would remember was the smell: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans cooked with bacon, cornbread. The scent poured from the open doors like a prayer made of food, and the German women approaching in their work clothes felt that familiar confusion. This abundance, this impossible persistent abundance. They had been brought here after morning work at the Johnson farm. Another act of community outreach, the guards explained. Local volunteers wanted to provide a meal, to show Christian charity even to former enemies. The words sounded hollow to women who no longer knew what words meant. Inside, long tables were covered with white cloths. Plates and silverware gleamed under simple light fixtures. And at the far end, women in aprons stood beside serving tables laden with food. Real Southern cooking prepared with care, offered freely. The townspeople lined the walls. Some watched with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. A few with something that might have been pity. The German women filed in under guard, aware of every eye on them, aware that they were specimens on display, enemy soldiers made safe, prisoners who could be examined without danger. "Sit, please," an elderly woman said. She wore a flowered dress and had kind eyes that reminded Margaret painfully of her own grandmother. "Eat. You must be hungry after working in this heat." The women sat. Plates were brought, heaping plates of food that steamed and glistened. Fried chicken with skin so crisp it crackled. Potatoes whipped smooth with butter and cream. Greens cooked until tender. Cornbread that crumbled at the touch. And for dessert, pies. Apple, pecan, sweet potato. The kind of food that required not just ingredients, but time and care. Margaret looked at her plate and felt the weight of it like a stone. Her mother's last letter sat in her pocket, the paper worn from repeated reading. "We eat potato peels boiled in water that tastes of rust." This was the contrast. This was the unbridgeable gap between her two worlds. She picked up her fork. Around her, other women did the same. Some ate quickly, defensively. Some ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be their last. Frida ate with tears streaming down her face, unable to stop them, unable to stop eating either. Then Margaret bit into the apple pie. The crust was buttery and flaked on her tongue. The apples were sweet and tart, cooked with cinnamon and sugar. It tasted like childhood, like holidays before the war, like a world that had existed once and was now as distant as stars. She thought of her mother's voice. "Save the peels for soup. Do not waste anything. Every scrap must be used." And here she sat eating pie made from whole apples, the peels baked right in because America had enough, had more than enough, had so much that peels could be wasted on sweetness instead of hoarded for survival. The contrast was not just unfair, it was obscene, and yet she could not stop eating. A small boy approached the table, perhaps 8 years old, with a cowlick and freckles and eyes full of the fearless curiosity of children. His mother reached for him, but he dodged her hand and walked right up to Frida. "Are you really a Nazi?" he asked. The hall went quiet. Every adult froze. Frida looked at the boy, this child who knew war only from newspapers and radio broadcasts, who had never seen his city burn or his family die. "I am just Frida," she said gently in her careful English. "From Germany. Did you shoot at Americans? Numb. I was radio operator. I just listen. To messages. To music sometimes." The boy considered this. "My dad is fighting in Germany right now. Is it scary there?" Frida's voice caught. "Yes, very scary. Scarier than thunderstorms, much scarier. Like if thunderstorms could destroy whole cities. Like if lightning could take away everyone you love." The boy's eyes widened. "Oh, that is very scary." His mother appeared then, her face apologetic and uncertain. She took her son's hand. I am sorry. He does not understand. Is okay, Frida said. He asks good questions. The mother looked at Frida for a long moment, seeing not an enemy but a young woman with sad eyes who spoke kindly to children. She nodded once and led her son away. But the moment lingered. The whole hall had witnessed it. The humanizing of the enemy, the collapse of the comfortable distance that hatred requires. After the meal, the women helped clean up. It seemed the least they could do. They washed dishes alongside the church ladies who had cooked for them. Awkward conversations happened in broken English and simpler German. Where are you from? Do you have family? Will you go home soon? Simple questions that carried the weight of continence. One elderly woman stood beside Helene at the washing basin. They worked in silence for several minutes. Then the woman spoke. I lost my husband in the First War, in France, 1918, and my nephew in this one. Pacific Theater, 2 wars, 2 generations, too much death. Helene nodded. I lost my husband at Stalingrad, and my son. He died while I was here. Pneumonia, starvation. He was 7. The woman's hands stilled in the soapy water. I am sorry. No child should die like that. No mother should carry that grief. They finished the dishes in silence. But before Helene left, the woman touched her arm gently. War makes monsters of good people and victims of everyone else. I hope you find peace someday. Helene could not speak. She simply nodded and walked away. The trucks drove them back to camp as evening fell. The women were quiet, each lost in her own thoughts. They had seen more of America today. They had been fed by people who had lost sons to German guns. They had been treated with kindness by those who had every right to hate, and it was destroying them more thoroughly than cruelty ever could. That night in the barracks, Elsa finally spoke. She had been silent for weeks, isolated with her small group of resistors. But now she stood in the center of the room and her voice carried to every bunk. This is how they break us, not with beatings or starvation, but with this, food, soap, kindness. They make us feel grateful. They make us forget who we are. What we fought for what Frida's voice cut through the room. We fought for lies, Elsa. We fought for a regime that murdered millions, that destroyed our own country as thoroughly as the bombs did. You do not know that. You believe their propaganda. I believe what I see. I see that America stands whole while Germany is ash. I see that they feed us while our families starve. I see that they treat us better than our own nation ever did. Elsa's face flushed with anger. You are a traitor. No, I'm awake. And I think you are too. I think you know the truth. You are just too proud to admit it. The room held its breath. Elsa and Frida faced each other across the wooden floor. Young versus slightly older. Acceptance versus denial. The future versus the past. Elsa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came, because Frida was right. Deep down in places Elsa would not acknowledge even to herself she knew. She had known since the film. The film. It had come 3 days ago, the thing none of them could unknow. The truth that had shattered every comfortable lie. The guards had announced it at morning assembly. Mandatory attendance. All prisoners to report to the mess hall at 1400 hours. A film would be shown. An educational film about the war. About Germany. About what had been done in their name. They had filed into the hall confused and apprehensive. A projector sat on a table at the back. A white sheet hung at the front. The lights were lowered. The projector clicked to life. At first it was just footage they had seen before. Allied troops advancing. German cities under bombardment. Soldiers surrendering. Nothing unexpected. Nothing shocking. Then the footage changed. Gates opening. American soldiers entering a camp. Not a prisoner of war camp. Something else. Something worse. Bodies. Stacked like cordwood. Skeletal. Inhuman in their thinness. Mountains of bodies. The women in the mess hall gasped. Some cried out, "No, this cannot be real. This is propaganda." Lies. But the footage continued. Survivors emerging from barracks, living skeletons with eyes that had seen hell. Children among them. Children who looked like ancient ghosts wearing skin too large for their bones. Gas chambers. The door shown opening. The mechanisms explained. This is where they were killed, hundreds at a time, thousands. Cremation ovens, still full of ash and bone fragments. Piles of belongings, shoes, thousands of shoes, children's shoes among them. Eyeglasses, suitcases with names painted on them. Evidence of lives interrupted, stolen, extinguished. Marguerite sat frozen. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench until her knuckles went white. This could not be real. Germany would not, could not. They were the civilized nation, the culture of Beethoven and Goethe. They would not do this. But the film showed German guards being arrested, showed German officers being confronted with what they had overseen, showed testimony from survivors. This happened. This was real. This was Germany. Helene ran from the hall and vomited outside. The sounds carried back through the open door. Other women covered their faces. Some screamed that it was lies, propaganda, impossible. But their voices grew weaker as the footage continued, as the evidence mounted, as the truth became undeniable. Frida sat with her hands over her mouth, tears streaming between her fingers. She had lost her family to Allied bombs. She had hated the Americans for that, had carried that hatred like a shield. But this was something else entirely. This was systematic murder. This was evil on a scale that made her personal grief feel small. Elsa stood up. Her chair scraped loud in the silence. Lies, she shouted. All lies. They fabricated this. They built these camps after the war to discredit us. But her voice shook. And when Sergeant Walsh stood and spoke, his voice was quiet and firm. These camps were liberated by American and British troops. They were documented by dozens of journalists and photographers. The evidence has been verified by multiple sources. This is what your government did, whether you knew it or not, whether you participated or not. This was done in your name. The film ended. The lights came up. The room was full of sobbing women and stunned silence and the collapse of every comfortable certainty. That had been 3 days ago, and nothing had been the same since. Some women had broken completely. They lay in their bunks and would not eat, would not work, would not speak. The horror was too large to process. Others, like Frida, had moved through shock into a strange clarity. The war had not been what they thought. Germany had not been what they believed. Everything they had been taught was contaminated by this truth. And Elsa, proud, rigid Elsa. She had not eaten since the film. She sat outside at night, smoking cigarettes she bought with her wages, staring at the barbed wire fence, her face carved from stone. Margaret found her there on the second night after the film, 2 in the morning. The camp was silent except for crickets and the distant footsteps of guards. "Do you hate me?" Elsa asked without looking up. "No, I pity you." "Pity is worse than hate." Margaret sat beside her on the steps. "Tell me it was not all a lie. Tell me we believed in something real. We believed in a lie that killed millions. That is what was real." Elsa was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible. "I saw the films. I know it was real. I just cannot admit it. If I admit it, everything I am crumbles. My father, my teaching, my whole life. It all becomes complicit in that. Then let it crumble and build something new. I do not know how. None of us do. But we try." The night insects sang around them. Somewhere in the camp, a woman was crying. The sound carried on the still air. "What do we go home to?" Elsa asked. "If everything we believed was false, the truth, however painful, and maybe the chance to be better than what we were." Elsa said nothing, but the next morning she ate breakfast. Just a small amount. But she ate, and Margaret counted it as a victory. The weeks turned. 8 weeks. 9. The announcement came in early December. Repatriation would begin in January. The prisoners would be returned to Germany in groups. The process would take months. But it was starting. The camp erupted in mixed reactions. Some women were desperate to return, to find what remained of their families, to rebuild. Others were terrified. What was there to return to? What life waited in the ruins? And for a few, a secret hope. A possibility whispered late at night. The option to stay. It was rare, difficult, required sponsorship and documentation and proof of no Nazi affiliation. But it was possible. Some prisoners had stayed after the First War. Perhaps some could stay now. Frida wanted to stay. She admitted it only to Margaret late one night. I have nothing in Germany, no family, no home, no future. But here maybe I could build something. Maybe I could be free of all of it. Corporal Miller had offered to help. His family's farm in Iowa could sponsor her. They needed workers. They were willing to take a chance on a former enemy who spoke decent English and worked hard. It is not just about the work, Frida admitted. I think I care for him. Is that terrible to care for the enemy? He was never the enemy. Neither were you. You were just people on different sides of a terrible thing. Helene had decided to return. There was nothing for her in America. Her son was buried in Hamburg. Her duty was to go to his grave, to tend it, to continue living because he could not. Dorothy had asked her to stay, had offered to help her immigrate, but Helene refused gently. Germany is destroyed. It needs people willing to rebuild. I am a nurse. I can help. It will not bring Carl back, but maybe I can save other children. Maybe that is my penance. Elsa would return. Of course she would return, but she was different now, quieter. The rigid certainty had cracked. She no longer spoke of the Reich's glory. She spoke instead of guilt and responsibility and the long work of facing what had been done. And Margaret, she was torn. Her mother and brother needed her. Germany needed everyone willing to return and rebuild. But part of her wanted to stay, to remain in this land where soap was common and food was abundant and the war felt distant rather than immediate. In the end, she decided to return. Family was family, blood was blood. She could not abandon them no matter how comfortable captivity had become. The goodbyes began. Frida would stay behind. Her paperwork was being processed. The Miller family had agreed to sponsor her. She would go to Iowa when she was released, would work on a farm, would learn to be American. The night before the first transport departed, Frida and Margaret sat together on the barracks steps. Write to me, Frida said. Tell me how it is. Tell me if Germany can be saved. I will. And you live a good life here, a free life. Be happy for both of us. Frida handed Margaret a small package. My last chocolate bar for your brother. Tell him an American girl sent it. Tell him not everyone is an enemy. Margaret could not speak. She simply hugged Frida and held on tight. Dorothy found Helene in the infirmary packing medical supplies, small things she was allowed to take. Bandages, aspirin, not much but something. I will never forget you, Dorothy said. Nor I you. You showed me that kindness still exists, that people can be better than their governments. You showed me that people are more than their nations, that we are all just trying to survive. They embraced. Two women from opposite sides of the world brought together by war, separated now by peace. Even Sergeant Walsh sought out Margaret before she left. He found her in the laundry folding his brother's uniform one last time. Good luck out there, he said. Thank you for your fairness, for treating us like humans even when you did not have to. Geneva Convention. It is the law. It is more than that. You could have made our lives hell within the law. You chose not to. That is character. He nodded slowly. My brother would have wanted it that way. He was a good man, better than me. I think he would be proud of you. Walsh said nothing, but his jaw worked and he looked away quickly. The morning came, cold, overcast. The first group of 100 prisoners assembled at the gate. Margaret, Aline, Elsa, others whose names would blur in memory. Buses waited, then trains, then ships back across the Atlantic, back to the ruins. As the bus pulled away from Camp Ruston, Margaret looked back, at the clean barracks, at the mess hall where she had eaten like a human for the first time in years, at the laundry where she had learned that even enemies could be kind. And she thought about the soap, that first soap, the moment when everything she believed began to crumble, not because of cruelty, but because of dignity, not because of hatred, but because of unexpected humanity. The voyage home was the reverse of the journey out, but the women were different now, fed, healthy, changed. They arrived in Bremen in February of 1946. The port was gray and cold and the devastation was visible, even from the ship. Germany had become a graveyard of itself. Margaret found her mother and brother in a refugee center. Her mother had aged a decade. Her brother looked 40, though he was only 15. They stared at her as if she were a ghost. You are alive, her mother whispered. and so healthy. The guilt washed over Margaret like ice water. I am here now, Mama. I will help rebuild. Helene traveled to Hamburg, to the churchyard where her son lay buried. A small wooden cross marked the place. She knelt in the mud and wept. Her mother-in-law found her there. He spoke of you at the end, the old woman said. I know. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Come, there is work to do. And there was. Always work. The work of clearing rubble and finding food and surviving another day. The work of rebuilding a nation from ash. Elsa returned to Berlin. Her father was still in prison. Her family home was gone, but an uncle took her in reluctantly. She found work clearing rubble with thousands of other women. Physical labor that was also spiritual labor. Rebuilding the outside while trying to rebuild the inside. Months passed. Letters traveled slowly, but they traveled. Frida wrote from Iowa. She was working on the farm, learning English properly. She and Corporal Miller David now were courting. She sounded happy, almost free. Margaret worked for the Red Cross in Munich, reuniting families, using the English she had learned, making small differences in a landscape of massive suffering. Helene became a nurse again in Hamburg, treating starving children. Each one reminded her of Carl. Each one she saved was a small redemption. And late at night, when the work was done and the city lay dark around them, these women thought about America, about the enemy that had refused to be what they were told, about the soap and the food and the impossible kindness. Margaret kept her bar of soap, small now, worn down, but still there, a reminder, a symbol. She wrote in her diary in March of 1946, her final entry about the experience. The city I knew is gone. The nation I believed in never existed. But I think often of America, of Sergeant Walsh's fairness, of Dorothy's kindness, of the soap they gave us when they could have given us cruelty. The enemy taught us what our own nation forgot. That dignity is not weakness. That compassion is power. And that the true measure of a nation is not how it treats its friends, but how it treats its enemies. I will remember the lesson, and I will try to be better. She closed the book. Outside Munich lay in ruins, but somewhere in those ruins people were working, rebuilding, hoping, trying to create something better from the ashes of what had been. In Louisiana, Sergeant James Walsh sat in his small house looking at his brother's photograph. The uniform hung in his closet, cleaned and pressed one final time by a German woman who had understood grief. He thought about the prisoners he had overseen, about their tears over soap, about their gratitude for basic human dignity. He had wanted to hate them, had needed to hate them, but they had refused to be hate-able. They had been young and scared and human, just like his brother, just like him. What makes a nation great, he wondered? Not its weapons, not its power to destroy, but its choice to show mercy, its decision to remain human even when given every excuse to be otherwise. The crickets sang in the Louisiana night, and across an ocean in the ruins of Germany, women who had been enemies were now simply survivors, carrying with them the memory of an enemy's unexpected kindness, trying to build something better than what had been destroyed. The war had ended years ago, but the real victory, the one that mattered most, was still being won. One small act of dignity at a time, one bar of soap, one meal shared, one moment of choosing compassion over cruelty. That was the lesson. That was what the enemy's soap had taught them. And it was a lesson the world desperately needed to learn. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its soldiers. It was its values, its commitment to treating even enemies with basic human dignity, its belief that people were more than their nations, more than their governments, more than the worst things done in their names. And in a world being rebuilt from ashes, that belief might be the only thing strong enough to carry humanity forward. The enemy gave them soap, such a small thing, such a profound thing. And in that gift lay a truth more powerful than any propaganda. A truth that could not be denied or forgotten or destroyed. That even in the darkest times, even across the widest divides, humanity persists. Kindness endures. And the choice to be better than our worst selves remains always, always possible.